In this episode, we're going to slow down again on purpose and reinforce what you've built across analysis and pivoting, because these skills only become powerful when they are reliable under pressure. When people learn threat intelligence concepts in isolation, they can often explain each concept, but they struggle to combine them into a consistent workflow when the evidence is messy and the timeline is unclear. This review boost is designed to lock the pieces together so you can move from weak signals to defensible hypotheses, from domains to infrastructure with intent, and from pivot chains to validated clusters without drifting into ghost chasing. The goal is not to repeat definitions for their own sake, but to strengthen your mental habits so they feel natural and repeatable. You should come out of this feeling that you know how to think, not just what to say, and that your approach would make sense to another analyst who had to pick up your work. With the foundation reinforced, the upcoming malware-focused topics will feel like a continuation rather than a sudden shift. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good way to begin this review is to remember what analysis is supposed to produce, because analysis can become noisy if you forget its purpose. Analysis is not the act of collecting more facts, and it is not the act of confidently labeling something as malicious as quickly as possible. Analysis is the act of turning information into decision support by testing explanations against evidence, weighing strength, and communicating confidence honestly. Structured analytic techniques exist to protect you from cognitive bias, not to slow you down forever, and the best sign that you are using them well is that your thinking becomes clearer rather than more complicated. You should be comfortable separating observation from inference, naming your assumptions, and considering alternatives early so you do not anchor to the first story that feels right. You should also be comfortable with the idea that uncertainty is normal and that your job is to reduce it, not to pretend it does not exist. When those habits are present, analysis becomes a disciplined craft rather than an improvisation. One of the biggest upgrades you should feel at this point is the ability to form testable hypotheses rather than vague suspicions. A hypothesis is useful when it makes predictions that can be checked and when it is scoped to a time window and a set of behaviors that matter to the requirement. If your hypothesis is too broad, it becomes impossible to test, and you drift into endless collection. If your hypothesis is too vague, it cannot be falsified, so you end up defending a belief rather than evaluating an explanation. A disciplined analyst often holds more than one hypothesis early, including a benign alternative, and then looks for discriminator evidence that would push confidence toward one explanation. This approach keeps you from premature closure and also keeps you from analysis paralysis, because you can still act with calibrated confidence while continuing to test. When you can state what would increase confidence and what would decrease it, you are thinking like a professional, because you have built a path for learning rather than a wall of certainty. Evidence discipline is another area that should now feel integrated rather than separate, because without it, analysis and pivoting become fragile. Rating sources and evidence means you treat provenance as part of the content, you look for independence, and you avoid confusing repetition with corroboration. You should be able to explain why one piece of evidence is stronger than another, not by personal preference, but by observable qualities like direct observation, specificity, and consistency across independent sources. You should also be able to recognize when an external claim lacks supporting artifacts and therefore must be treated as a lead rather than as a conclusion. This matters because pivoting often begins with an artifact that comes from somewhere, and if you do not rate that origin, you can spend hours exploring a weak rumor. Evidence discipline also supports communication because it gives you a clear reason for your confidence statements and a clear explanation of what remains unknown. When you apply evidence discipline consistently, your work becomes easier to defend and easier to improve. Triage is the other protective habit that should now feel essential because it is what makes your workflow scalable. Indicators can flood you, and the mere existence of an indicator does not mean it has intelligence value. You triage by asking whether it is relevant to the requirement, credible in sourcing and support, specific enough to discriminate, timely enough to matter, and rich enough in context to justify attention. You also decide whether an indicator is best treated as an action trigger, a pivot point, or a parked thread awaiting more context. This triage mindset prevents you from being pulled by dramatic but irrelevant signals, and it helps you allocate attention rationally, especially under time pressure. A mature triage decision is also revisable, meaning you can elevate a parked indicator later if new evidence connects it to meaningful behavior. When triage is integrated with evidence discipline, you stop reacting to noise and start investing attention where it will reduce uncertainty. Pivoting mastery begins when you stop treating pivoting as exploration and start treating it as hypothesis testing, because that is where intent becomes real. Pivoting from domains to infrastructure is valuable because domains connect to endpoints, hosting context, historical resolution, and registration breadcrumbs, all of which can reveal relationships that are more durable than a single artifact. The mistake beginners make is pivoting because they can, which leads to long lists and weak stories. Intent means you pivot to answer a question, to test a hypothesis, or to find discriminator evidence, and you stop when the pivot no longer adds decision value. You also incorporate time, because infrastructure relationships are dynamic, and a pivot that is true today may not explain an event from last month. Passive DNS helps you align relationships to the relevant window, while registration context can add operational breadcrumbs that strengthen or weaken cluster hypotheses. When you pivot with intent, the number of pivots you perform becomes less important than the clarity they produce. Link analysis is the skill that ties pivoting together because it externalizes relationships so you can see hidden clusters, bridges, and hubs that are not obvious in linear notes. Mastery here means you define entities and relationships clearly, treat links as evidence with strength and limits, and avoid giving every connection equal weight. You should be able to recognize that dense clusters can be meaningful, but can also be produced by benign shared infrastructure, so connectivity is a clue, not a verdict. You should also be able to spot join points where one mistaken link could merge unrelated clusters, which is why validation is critical. A strong link analysis mindset uses time-bounded relationships, because many links are only meaningful within a specific window, and ignoring time can create false clusters. When you use link analysis this way, you do not just collect associations, you build structured understanding that supports synthesis and communication. This is a major step toward professional-level reasoning because it makes your thinking transparent and testable. The phrase validate every pivot without chasing ghosts should now feel like a guiding principle rather than a warning, because it protects everything else you do. Every pivot is an analytic claim, and validation means checking time alignment, specificity, independence, and plausible benign explanations before you build further reasoning on top of the link. Ghost chasing happens when you treat suggestive links as confirmatory and keep expanding even when discriminating evidence does not increase. The defense is to set stopping points, summarize what has been learned, and prune weak branches that do not support the requirement. Validation also means recognizing loops, where the same underlying claim appears to corroborate itself, and refusing to let that inflate confidence. A disciplined analyst is comfortable saying that an association is tentative until it is supported by multiple independent links. This habit is what keeps your work defensible, because it prevents you from presenting coincidence as conclusion. Another part of mastery is synthesis, because analysis and pivoting only create value when you can turn them into a story that is clear, accurate, and usable. A synthesized story has anchor facts, supporting context, and clearly framed uncertainty, and it does not pretend that all evidence is equally strong. Synthesis also involves handling contradictions openly, explaining why they may exist, and stating what would resolve them rather than hiding them. This is where confidence communication becomes critical, because a story without calibrated confidence can still mislead. You should be comfortable distinguishing severity from certainty, explaining what you observed with higher confidence and what you inferred with lower confidence, and naming the key unknowns that still matter. When you communicate this way, stakeholders can act proportionally and can support the right follow-on work. This is what makes your intelligence work trusted rather than merely informative. A good self-check for this checkpoint is to imagine you are handed one weak signal, such as a single domain observed in an unusual context, and then walk through what you would do next. You would start by tying it to a requirement, then rate the evidence and source, then decide whether it merits triage elevation or parking. If elevated, you would form at least one testable hypothesis and one plausible benign alternative, then choose pivots that would discriminate between them. You would use historical context when necessary, map relationships through link analysis, and validate key links before expanding further. You would stop when uncertainty is sufficiently reduced to make a decision or when additional pivots stop producing discriminating evidence. Finally, you would synthesize the result into a clear story with stated confidence and explicit unknowns. If that workflow feels coherent, that means the skills are integrated, which is the real goal of mastery. As we conclude this review boost, the most important outcome is that you now have a disciplined loop for analysis and pivoting that can scale, stay honest, and resist bias. You can take weak signals, cluster them carefully, form testable hypotheses, and use pivoting and link analysis to build or break those hypotheses without being pulled into endless exploration. You can validate relationships, weigh evidence, and communicate confidence in a way that supports decisions rather than creating confusion. That foundation is what allows you to move into malware-focused analysis next, because malware artifacts and behaviors often generate many tempting pivots and many opportunities for bias. With these habits in place, you will be able to interpret malware behavior, extract durable features, and assess campaign reach without turning the work into a chaotic hunt for artifacts. Next, we'll begin that shift by learning how to read malware behavior to surface adversary goals, using the same disciplined reasoning you've practiced here to turn behavior observations into defensible intelligence.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.